Hey y'all, from the West Tennessee Delta Heritage Center and Tina Turner Museum. Where else can you find 5 museums collectively telling you all about the Tennessee Delta, especially music? Did you know Tina Turner is from here? We've got her one-room schoolhouse and it's filled with her costumes. Bluesman Sleepy John Estes' home is here too. An authentic Southern experience just waiting for you right off of I-40 at exit 56 in Brownsville, Tennessee. We can't wait to see you soon.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you for watching wherever you are this evening. And thank you for celebrating the Southern Festival of Books with us. I'm Jeremy Finley. I'm a journalist and a novelist here in Nashville, and it is my great pleasure tonight to introduce you to Matthew Van Meter. Matthew is the author of this incredible book, Deep Delta Justice. He is going to talk about that with you in just a moment and give a great presentation, and we'll have a conversation afterwards. Briefly want to just introduce Matthew. He has worked for some of the most prestigious publications in the country, including the Atlantic, the New Republic, Longreads, as well as the Owl. He's a graduate of Middlebury College and Columbia University, one of the best journalism schools out there. He also reports on criminal justice, teaches at the College for Creative Studies, and works as the Assistant Director for Shakespeare in Prison. We got a lot to talk about tonight, including the foundations of this book, which I think really is an untold story of the civil rights era that a lot of people should know about. So Matthew, I'm going to hand it over to you, and thank you for being a part of this tonight.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thanks so much, Jeremy. And quickly, I went to the School of the Arts at Columbia, which no less prestigious, but a little less journalisty.
A little less journalistic, but I had to get that shot out.
It's been a not path through things, but anyway, thank you so much for that introduction. It's really my pleasure. So tonight, I want to situate us in a place. I want to introduce you to some people. And I want to talk about why that place and those people are relevant today. And I kind of want to turn your understanding of the civil rights movement upside down a little bit, kind of shake it and see what's in its pockets, because that's what history is about to me. And I promise that'll be interesting. I promise it'll only take 20 minutes, at which point I'll very happily turn control of the conversation over to Jeremy, who I assume is going to use his best investigative journalist zingers to turn me into like a puddle on the floor. It should be a sight to see. But first, I promised you a place. And I think we can bring up the map. Awesome. This is Plaquemines Parish, Louisiana. And if you'll allow me, I think the best way to put you there is to read a couple of paragraphs just from the first chapter of the book. Plaquemines Parish is the end of the road. It sits at the extreme end of the Mississippi River, southeast of New Orleans, almost entirely surrounded by the Gulf of Mexico. The river built it, and the river defined it. Every granule of earth that made up Plaquemines had been carried by water from the Great Plains or the Appalachians or the Rockies, eventually building a delta in the shape of a bird's foot. From its source in Minnesota to its mouth near Boothville, the Mississippi River carved a 2,300-mile path through the interior of the United States, forming the third most populous river basin in the world. The mouth of the Mississippi in Plaquemines was the anchor of a vast expanse of marshland that stretched from the Everglades to Mexico. The marsh had always drawn people to Plaquemines. Only 5% of the land in the parish lay between the levees and could be built on. The rest was wetlands, fretted by bayous and great fields of grass that overflowed with life. There were even settlements out there, tiny clutches of wooden shacks built on stilts and accessible only by boat, where people subsisted on what they could shoot or trap or catch in a net. But for most of the parish's 24,000 residents, life existed on the narrow ribbon of land between the levees. Everything in Plaquemines was either up the road or down the road. You know, for me, the first time I went to Plaquemines, that's kind of what was strangest to me, was you literally can't get lost down there. There aren't any wrong turns to make. There's just the one road. Despite it just being 15 or 20 minutes from downtown New Orleans to the Parish line, Plaquemines is one of the most isolated places in the United States, at least by land. And in the 1960s, when the story takes place, there was just one road connecting it to the rest of civilization. 100 years ago, there was no road. But for a long time, it had been poor. Ships passed by on their way to New Orleans, but Plaquemines didn't really have a port to speak of. It had plenty of wildlife, oysters and fish and shrimp and all sorts of birds, and it was at one time the largest producer of furs in America, but fishing and hunting and trapping aren't where the real money is. The real money is in oil. And in the early 20th century, oil was discovered in the marsh, which led to a boom that went on for decades. I'm sure everybody watching has heard of Deepwater Horizon or recalls that disaster. Well, that and all of the other offshore oil rigs out there off the coast of Louisiana are based in Plaquemines. And after that, the money started coming in. Oops, there we go. Money started coming in. So Plaquemines was this isolated backwater. It was also a natural bottleneck with the one road. And it suddenly, improbably discovered that it held one of the greatest concentrations of petroleum in the world. So it sounds like a pretty perfect location to establish a dictatorship, right? Which brings us to our first person, Leander Perez. So Leander Perez came to power in Plaquemines in 1919. He didn't relinquish control over the parish until his death in 1969. So for those 50 years, he controlled life in Plaquemines to a degree that would have made him the envy of much more familiar dictators in other nations. And for a long time, he used his power to crush his political adversaries, including, and this is true, and I encourage you to look it up, an armed standoff with the National Guard during World War II that went down in Louisiana political history as the Little War, I guess because World War II was the big one. But then 1954 rolled around, and the Supreme Court unanimously decided Brown versus Board of Education, and Perez, who had been a racist before, but hadn't ever really specifically targeted the Black people who lived in Plaquemines, announced a few days later that he was dedicating his life to preserving segregation of the races. And that was when he changed from oddball Louisiana political figure to one of the most famous segregationists in America at the time. Nationally, he was known for, especially for being willing to say overtly racist things long after other segregationists had wised up and learned to be more careful with their language. In fact, he delighted in breaking those norms, in saying the unsayable, in speaking aloud the id of Southern segregationists. And it should be said, a lot of Northerners too. So he had declared war on the Black people in his community. And that brings us to our second person, Gary Duncan. So Gary grew up in Boothville, which is the second to last town accessible by road on the Mississippi River. It's just above the mouth. He grew up in a big, boisterous family full of fiercely independent men and women. Their father, Lambert, was the first Black man to run crew boats for the segregated oil industry. He used to sleep on his boat to keep his white competitors from setting the boat on fire. And the whole family was deeply involved in the church. So in October 1966, Gary Duncan had just turned 19. He was newly married. His first child had been born just days before. He was driving down the road. That's right, the one road, driving down it. And he saw two of his relatives, kids, middle schoolers, talking to four white kids on this stretch of highway by the school. No big deal, except for two things. Gary knew that the schools had just been desegregated by a federal court, so tensions were high, especially in school. So he didn't like that. He knew that Perez had fought hard against the desegregation of those schools. He didn't like that either. But the thing he didn't like the most was the fact that there were a bunch of white men, adults, standing on the other side of the road and watching. So he got out of the car, broke up this fight that was about to happen, and right when he was about to turn to go, he put his hand on the arm of one of the white boys and he said, "Best run along home." And if you followed the news recently, you can probably guess what happened next. One of the white men who was watching all of this called the cops, and Gary got arrested and charged with battery. But Gary and his family, it must be said, are blessed and cursed with an overdeveloped sense of justice. So instead of lying down and taking it, Gary lawyered up. And that brings me to the third person. That's Richard Sobel. Richard Sobel was 29 in 1966. Bright, ambitious, he's intense, totally out of place in New Orleans. He was Jewish from New York City, third in his class at Columbia Law School, hadn't ever really spent time in the South, certainly not in the Deep South. But in 1965, he volunteered his vacation days to take civil rights cases when he was at a law firm in Washington, D.C. And when he was down there, he caught the bug. And in 1966, he quit his fancy job at Arnold and Porter, still one of the nation's most prestigious law firms, to take civil rights cases in Louisiana. He was part of a small army of lawyers who came down to enforce the hard-won victories of the civil rights movement. And it's worth pausing for a moment to think about what that means and how many of you, I assume, hadn't ever really thought about that before. I know I hadn't. The story we tell about the civil rights movement usually begins with Emmett Till and Brown versus Board of Education and hits some highlights: sit-ins, freedom rides, I Have a Dream, Edmund Pettus Bridge, Selma, Alabama, all that stuff. It ends with the passage of the Civil and Voting Rights Acts in 64 and 65, respectively, right? I hope that sounds familiar. And then maybe we mumble something about sanitation workers or Detroit or Black Power or other things that make us, for the most part, uncomfortable. And then we fast forward to Dr. King's assassination in 1968. And his martyrdom gave us a tidy conclusion to the story, and also it gives us the sense that something concrete was accomplished and now it's over. Something concrete was accomplished. I'm not going to badmouth those victories. They were huge. But the truth of it is that that story about the civil rights movement is only the beginning. Take Brown versus Board of Education, for example. Did anybody else's high school history class not exactly dwell on the fact that the Supreme Court outlawed school segregation in 1954? But the first big city to desegregate was New Orleans 6 years later, or that Memphis still hadn't desegregated 18 years later. And I'm not just talking about de facto segregation, right, like we have now. This is old school, straight up de jure bylaw segregation with very, very few exceptions. Nashville actually was one of them, by the way. School districts in the South simply ignored Brown versus Board of Education, and they ignored the Civil and Voting Rights Acts. And how could they do that? Because there's no Supreme Court police. The justices just say stuff, and the rest of us need to figure out how to make it happen. There's no congressional police force. Lawmakers make laws, and that's nice for them, but somebody has to enforce them. And enforcement means lawsuits. In this case, hundreds of lawsuits, thousands of lawsuits. A lawsuit against every recalcitrant school district, local government, municipality, business, union, organization that refuse to comply with federal law. And lawsuits mean lawyers, like a lot of lawyers. And let me tell you, most Southern lawyers, white lawyers, were not jumping at the chance to litigate desegregation cases in their community. And there just weren't enough Southern Black lawyers to do all the work, especially because it rarely pays anything at all. So lawyers came from the North and the West, but especially from New York City, especially from the children and grandchildren of Eastern European Jews who had survived pogroms and ghettos and the Holocaust, which takes us back to Richard Sobel. He was part of this massive wave of lawyers, very much like him, who came down to make good on the promises made by the Supreme Court and Congress. He worked for years with 3 young radical Black attorneys and a host of brave clients to bring racial integration to the South. But even among that army of lawyers, Richard stood out. He was among the smartest, most dedicated, and the most creative of them. He was one of the most influential lawyers in the early days of Title VII law, that's employment discrimination, from the Civil Rights Act, and a mind-bogglingly successful litigator of everything from school desegregation cases to injunctions intended to curb police brutality. He tried hundreds of cases in a very short amount of time. And so he took Gary's case in 1966, this insignificant misdemeanor case, one that on the surface had nothing to do with race at all. It was a battery case. Battery is illegal in every state still. Although, of course, it had everything to do with race. And against them stood Leander Perez, one of the most powerful segregationists in Louisiana, one of the most powerful in the country. Dictator of Plaquemines Parish, a man who had been a parish judge and then prosecutor, and who for 20 years had been referred to quite seriously as the third house of the Louisiana legislature. And the Plaquemines district attorney, who was in charge of Gary's prosecution, his name was Leander Perez Jr., his son. And that's more or less where the book begins. So obviously you'll need to read to see what happens to all these characters. But I also promised that I'd tell you about why this story, which started almost 55 years ago, is relevant today. So today, I don't think I have to tell you, we're living in a time of really terrible regional, racial, and political division. I think we're facing a gathering storm of resistance to the rule of law and the hard-won civil rights victories of the past. I mean, just look at voting rights, which I didn't even mention earlier, but which feature prominently in the book, or look at our police departments. Look at our ever more segregated schools, our neighborhoods, and tell me it's not coming to a head. And when things come to a head in America, they usually head to court. And so these three people, Richard Sobel, Gary Duncan, Leander Perez, each of them teaches us a lesson about how to win the battles to come. I think Leander Perez teaches us about the nature of the enemy. That racism and segregation and bigotry in the law are never actually about being old-fashioned or static. Those people are every bit as innovative as any lawyer in Silicon Valley. Perez was one of the architects of the system we now call Jim Crow, but architect isn't even really the right word, because Jim Crow is not a building that was built. It was something that was always on the move. It was fluid, always shifting, changing. It was always staying one step ahead of integration. And Perez died more than 50 years ago, but that movement is still as innovative as it ever was. Richard Sobel teaches us the importance of out-innovating people like Perez and the importance of funding that work. Richard could never have taken that job in New Orleans had he not been supported by a nonprofit organization. I think Richard also teaches us the importance of humility as a white person in the struggle for racial justice, what today we call allyship. And one of the reasons his clients trusted him so much is that it was never about him. He never told his clients what to do, never saw himself as a leader of the movement. He was, as one of his colleagues once said, a technician, like a plumber. He had a job to do and he was exceptionally good at it, but he worked for the activists and citizens who needed his help, not the other way around. And Gary was one of those clients. He teaches us the importance of being truly unreasonable in the pursuit of justice. He's taught me a lot about that. There's a reason no one fights dumb misdemeanor cases like his, especially in the Jim Crow South, especially in Plaquemines Parish under Leander Perez, but even today, it's not worth it. Gary suffered more as a result of fighting his case than he would have if he had just pled guilty, taken his punishment, and moved on, as almost 98% of criminal defendants do in America today. But Gary refused, because refusing was the right thing to do. And thank God for that. I actually want to let Gary close out this sort of introduction here. So I wanted to bring him to the festival back when we were all supposed to actually go to Nashville before COVID and social distancing and Zoom and whatever else we've all gotten good at or tried to get good at. So in July, I filmed a conversation with him. And as usual, he puts it best. He was not only a fierce advocate in court, but he was someone who saw his clients as full human beings and treated them as such, and that meant a lot to Gary personally. And Richard and Gary stayed friends until Richard's death earlier this year. I spent some time with the two of them in January up in where Richard lived in Northern California, which is really beautiful. And that's the kind of that's the kind of person we need on the front lines these days. And we need people like Gary who are just completely unreasonable in their devotion to pursuing what's right.
You know, there's so many questions that I've got for you, Matthew, but I want to start with the very first. If you could summarize for us what he said in that piece of audio. We had some trouble hearing that audio. We could see it, but can you just summarize for us what Gary had to say?
Yeah, sure. I mean, he said some of what I said before, and that Gary knew that it was always about him. That his relationship with Richard was never about Richard. It was about work, but it was also about forging a relationship of trust. And Gary and Richard not only remained friends the rest of their lives, but Gary talks in the clip I tried to show about how they were really someone special to each other, and just how important that was for Gary, especially at that time in his life when he was young. He was also vulnerable, right? To feel not just accepted, but by this person who came from a world that Gary knew nothing of, right? And Richard knew nothing of Gary's world, but that they were able to come together as equals and work together. And it really was in a way that is true so infrequently in those sorts of relationships between lawyers and clients. There was really a partnership where they worked together to do what needed to be done.
You know, one of the first things I wanted to ask you, and you would know this because of how well you got to know Gary, but he was such a young man when this happened, a new father, really just working to survive, right, and to provide for his family. Did he know what he was risking by going as far as he did in the court system to basically fight this minuscule charge? Did he know what he was risking? And did he know how big, did he have an inkling of how big this would become?
I don't think he knew how big it would become, although he certainly, once by the time they were at the, spoiler alert, at the Supreme Court building, that was, he was clear on that and what that meant. But no, I mean, nobody thought it would. It was sort of a Hail Mary pass. He was very clear on what he was risking, though. And his family was clear on that. In some ways, probably more clear than Gary, and I don't think this is giving anything away to say that, one of the moments that sticks out most in Gary's mind and that shows up in the book in a big way, is when he got the initial guilty verdict at trial, which nobody takes these cases to trial, witnesses and all that stuff. It just doesn't happen that often, misdemeanors. But he did, and there was a whole trial. And then, and he thought that he was going to win. He thought that Richard had made a really good case for him. He thought that, that his side had been credible and the other side hadn't, which, reading the transcript, which I hunted down a few years ago, I think is as close to objectively true as anything can be in a court of law. And so for him, it was hearing that guilty verdict that I talked to him about that story over and over again. And the thing he kept saying was I felt myself fall through the floor. And it was this moment where, more than anything, and it took me a long time, because I have the limitations of my own, personal experience and identity, to realize what he was really saying, that was the moment he saw sort of the way things were, that his family, he's the youngest of 9, and his family had sheltered him, and they were certainly aware. He turned around, he looked at his mother in the back row, and she was crying, and he realized that she got it. And then he got it, that the whole thing was rigged from the beginning.
Oh gosh.
That he didn't really have a chance. And he felt, and this is one of these things where, talking to him more than 50 years later, it is still traumatic to him, even though, the guy doesn't have a criminal conviction, right? He won his case eventually at the Supreme Court. But that feeling of helplessness sticks with him.
Yeah, it's a trauma, when you go through that much, and essentially you're innocent the entire time, and you have all of these people that are basically lying, from the very beginning. When you read about what the boys that were there, and they were lying, and they lied to their parents, who then told this fictional story to police. And I think that is the outrage. We talk about that investigative journalism is the journalism of outrage. Well, that's basically what your story is about. And I think why it's so important for people to read this, to understand what's happened then is very much happening still today. And so I got to ask you that first. I asked you this before we began, but how'd you even find it? Here you are, a grad student. How did you find this story? And how did you know, I need to commit so many years of my life to tell it?
I had been reporting on criminal justice for a little while at that point. That was sort of what I went to grad school to do, was to give myself the time and space. Columbia was generous enough with me that I was able to swing it for a couple of years. And I because I was interviewing all of these lawyers, I spent all this time interviewing people in Bronx family court, and I wrote a profile of Robin Steinberg, who's an innovative public defender in the Bronx. And, I was interviewing all of these lawyers and realized that, I wanted to be able to interview a lawyer without sounding like an idiot. So because I was, settled up at Columbia, I enrolled in a law school class, which, I'm sure there are other art school students who wind up in law classes, one way or another, but that was not many of us. And so I was there, and, we covered the right to jury trial. And when you cover the right to jury trial in a criminal procedure class in law school, Duncan versus Louisiana is the case. And so I heard a version of the story that appears in the book from the professor. And I don't know how else to say it. I just knew. I knew as soon as I saw that nobody had written that book, which is the first thing I did. I looked it up because I wanted to buy that book, because it was a pretty good story, and nobody wrote it. And I think I walked out of class that evening, and I knew that what I needed to do was drop everything and write that book.
How receptive were the people involved in this book, from Gary to his family to an outsider that they'd never met, come to them and say, "Hey, I'd kind of like to write a book about your case"? Were they receptive, or were they hesitant to speak with you?
Initially, different people differently. And eventually ended up spending a lot of time in Plaquemines Parish, and and with Gary's family and at his church and with the community. But Gary was initially skeptical of me. I think I would have been skeptical of me. And it took me about a year to get to the point where I could have an interview on the record with him. I contacted Richard right away because I had a way to get to him through Columbia Law School, where he was an alum. And Richard was very helpful and gave a bunch of just really rich, wonderful interviews early in the process that I went back to again and again and again. And then Richard, for any number of reasons, some of which I know, some of which I probably don't, sort of walked that back about a year later, right as I was kind of getting in with Gary. And with Gary, it was two things. It was, I think, persisting was part of it. And then part of it also was, Gary's a businessman. Gary is pretty savvy. He was raised to be financially independent. And so the idea of someone coming down, whatever, 30-year-old white kid from the North coming down and be like, hey, I want to tell your story. I can't pay you a dime. Didn't rub him the right way, or it rubbed him the wrong way. And like that, and I get that. I told him that from the beginning, ethics are still what they are.
Right.
But that took a while to overcome and wound up what we came to. And I was initially I did this, I think, out of a sense of obligation to the book or desperation or something. But it's ended up being, frankly, one of the highlights of it for me is I donate a portion of the proceeds of the book to Mount Olive Missionary Baptist Church, which is Gary's church. It was also one of the hubs of underground resistance to Perez's regime, and particularly when it came to voter registration. There was a time when something like 20% of the Black people in Plaquemines Parish registered to vote were named Duncan. And this was before the Voting Rights Act, when they still had to get past all the constitutional interpretation test, which Perez wrote and rigged, and that story's in the book. Yeah. And all of these other measures designed to, the registrar would close when they saw Black people coming down the street or whatever, and they organized late at night in that church in order to win their the right that had been guaranteed them for it's about 100 years at that point.
Right.
And so that ended up for me ended up being this really important thing where it was not just a gesture to Gary, but actually ultimately a gesture to that church. Right. That has been so vital to the life of the Black community in Plaquemines Parish for decades.
When we talk about how this story is still so, I don't know if effective is the right word, but it impacts people today when you read it, that you're like, man, this feels uncomfortably like the world that we live in today. I told you before this that you could not have created a better villain with the Perez family, senior and junior. I wanted to see if you could talk a little bit to those people who haven't read the book to understand the language that the judge, as he is known in the book, uses is so similar to the language that we are hearing nightly on the news said by certain politicians and pundits. Were you struck by how he talked and the way he ran his political life and how that is still used today?
Yeah. I mean, of course. Although it was interesting, I stumbled on the story in March of 2015 when Donald Trump was not taken seriously as a politician, and so that was a resonance for me that sort of came about, particularly like a year later. And when I was looking for a publisher, obviously it was something that I was asked to talk about a bunch. There's so many points of contact between this book and the world we live in. And I often joke sort of morbidly that writing a book about, segregation and Jim Crow and all that is, deja vu is the biggest occupational hazard. And there's some truth to that. I think in terms of Perez's rhetoric, sure, and even early in his career, he was, he said things that he shouldn't have said, right? And that was part of his allure. That was part of why he was able to break up the sort of old guard, like professional politician, Bourbon, New Orleans, Louisiana, class of Democrats, and sort of get in as a sort of, stick of dynamite style reform candidate, right? In some ways, I ended up being struck more by the differences between Perez and, let's say, Donald Trump, or the sort of brand of populists that is sort of taking the world by storm right now. In part because the thing about Perez is that he worked his butt off. I mean, he was a brilliant lawyer, and he had an attention to detail that most political leaders don't have in quite the same way that he did. I mean, he was both this kind of brash demagogue, by day, and then by night he was staying up writing the laws, hundreds of them, that we now know as Jim Crow. And so, like the actual words of them specifically laying down tax in the sort of the progress of racial integration, and ultimately, and the dozens and dozens of Black people I interviewed in Plaquemines Parish have been telling me this from the beginning, and I hadn't, I think, known how to listen to them for a while. I never white nobody in Plaquemines Parish publicly anyway says that they support Leander Perez, right? At best, they'll say he did some good things, and he probably did. But white people in Plaquemines Parish today tend to remember the rhetoric. They tend to focus on the things that Perez said that make us cringe now, and rightly so. Black people in Plaquemines Parish never mention that. Actually, not once was that like the thing that they led with in an interview. And in most interviews I did with Black people in Plaquemines Parish, they didn't mention it at all. And not that he wasn't, like spouting all sorts of hateful rhetoric. It's that for people in Gary's community, that was so not the point. And the point was regardless of what he said, they focused on the fact that he was staying up all night penning laws that were denying them their constitutional rights.
Right.
That was what stung. Right.
And I imagine to some degree they knew changing his rhetoric was not a battle they could win, but they might be able to win in court.
Right. And finally were able to, and went from like underground resistance to finally in the, after his death, and Duncan versus Louisiana, Gary Duncan's case was symbolically, it was not literally an attack on the Perez regime, but certainly symbolically it was. For Leander Perez to lose at the Supreme Court was a big deal, and symbolically for that community. At the same time that all of these other victories were happening, there's a scene in the book right after the first big election after the Voting Rights Act, where all of these Black Plaquemines residents are registering to vote, and there's nothing Leander Perez can do, finally, right, after all these years. And that was what people in the Black community talked about exclusively to me. And so like I ended up, coming sort of full circle to where what was interesting to me about Perez was not so much the words that he used, because he used all sorts of hateful words. But what was really pernicious about him was the work that he did and how long it took to undo that work.
Right. And the fact that before any of this happened, he had basically remade this area because of the devastation of the hurricane, which brings me to my next question. Because I think it's interesting when your first chapter is called A Dirty Storm, and you talk about Hurricane Betsy. And I'm interested to find out why you chose to start with that instead of jumping right into, because you could have started this book right with Gary going and doing this, but you start with this hurricane, and I'm wondering why you decided to do that. I know why I think you did, but I wondered why.
The short answer is I have a very indulgent editor. I also, by the way, started in outer space, which you kindly declined to mention, right, with the Gemini
Oh, that's right.
program, for like a paragraph or an
Yes,
excerpt.
yes, that's right. That's right. I suppose that it just seems like the narrative really begins.
Which I wrote that and I was like, there's no way my editor's going to let me keep this in. Like, come on, man. This is self-indulgent. Whatever, I typed it up anyway and she let me keep it. So thank you, Vanessa Mobley, super editor. Anyway, sorry. Yeah. You asked about Betsy, and the Hurricane Betsy. And I closed, spoiler alert, Jeremy, I closed with Hurricane Camille. I mean, part of that's because like the story is bounded really nicely in time. This is another one of these things. Like, you can't make up a villain as good as Leander Perez. You also can't make up a historical story that takes place in such a nicely bounded time frame, right? It's like 66 to 68. Yeah. And then Hurricane Betsy was the most destructive hurricane in U.S. history until Hurricane Katrina in 65. And Hurricane Camille was the most intense hurricane to make landfall still in the United States. That was in 1969. And so it totally devastated Plaquemines, both of them, in different ways. And so for me, like, some of it was sort of a literary thing, wanting to open, like, there's something about creative destruction and something about a clean storm and a dirty storm, and like, bookending you'll see that the final sentence is very much like the first one. But in a less sort of highfalutin way, I think for me, what was important as a storyteller about both hurricanes, but especially the first one in the first chapter, is that it lets you take the measure of that place. This is a place that is incredibly vulnerable to the elements, that is also isolated, and it also shows Leander Perez's power, right? So for me, it was this really efficient way to give you a sense of the place. It was also how I started all of my interviews with every single person in Plaquemines Parish, because it would get them thinking about the 60s, but it wasn't racially charged. And everybody remembers where they were during Betsy, because it destroyed everything.
Yes.
Right? Nobody was left untouched.
Right. And I that's what I took away from that, was that here was this place that was devastated. And then Perez was a lot of ways, especially known to the white community, as the hero that helped rebuild it. And so here's this man that so many people are indebted to. And so when this all happens, they already feel like, well, this guy kind of took care of us, and he's, and so he must be right. And so I thought that was a really great way to set up the story. But I don't want Perez to have the last word. I want Gary to have the last word. And my question for you is, why don't we know this story? How has this been such a small part of our history? Why don't we know this?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've thought about that pretty often. I think some of it is because it's a little bit, the story's a little slippery. You come in for the Supreme Court case, which is about the right to jury trial. I mean, I got into this not because I'm interested in, the history of desegregation or the Jim Crow South, although I'm not uninterested in those things. Like, I'm a criminal justice reporter and I work with incarcerated people. Like, I'm interested in criminal justice stuff. I got into this for the jury trial angle of it. But in the end, that's not, that's the issue that went to the Supreme Court, and it's not nothing. But the story is so much bigger than that. And by bigger, I mean, the Supreme Court's about as like high up as you can go within the legal system, certainly in terms of the stakes. And this was a landmark case, Duncan versus Louisiana. It's hugely important, but it has its tentacles out into all these different parts of American history and Southern history and Louisiana history, that most of which I didn't know about. I didn't know about this army of lawyers coming down to the South to file these thousands of lawsuits. How did I not know about that, right? I mean, that's, forget about Duncan versus Louisiana, although I think it's super important and interesting. Like, why did I not know what it actually took to enforce civil rights laws, right? I've taken American history. It's that kind of stuff, and all of this, Richard's work with around employment discrimination. All of these groups, armed, not nonviolent groups of activists all over the South, who were much more part of the daily lives of civil rights activists than sort of Martin Luther King and the sort of nonviolent movement, as important as that was, right? It just didn't get covered.
Right.
And so for me, it was about unearthing all of this stuff that's like, and I ask myself constantly why it's not a bigger part of my understanding of history as a reasonably well-educated person. And the answer is because it's messy and it's uncomfortable.
Right.
You know?
And it's
so much of what happens in this story, as not close, as tightly bounded as the story is, so much of the context of the story is about what's messy and uncomfortable, but real.
Right. And I think that's what, I mean, you could very much look at this thing and say, wow, you've got, again, and I don't want to oversimplify, but we have a great villain, a great hero, the heroes that help him along. But you're right in the sense that it's not a singular narrative that carries it. It has all of these different parts, but I just think it's important that people know. And I wonder, finally, does Gary feel like that he has a major role in the civil rights era? Does he himself feel that?
Gary's a very modest person, and Gary's a good friend. I think Gary's really humble about his role and doesn't want to oversell it. However, he knows that his name shows up all over law school textbooks. It litters the footnotes of criminal procedure and criminal law opinions, and has for more than 50 years. He understands that. And I think too, for him, having that recognized has been really important in a lot of ways. This is the first time a lot of his, extended family members had found out about this story, because I think, mostly after the thrill of the big win, he's a working man. He went back to being a captain of a tugboat and shrimping, and he's still a captain of a tugboat. So he's not going to get a big head about it, but he knew that the case he fought over this stupid misdemeanor ended up securing a really important right for millions of American citizens who get accused of crimes. And he doesn't forget that. So I think he's mostly just kind of tickled that everybody suddenly wants to pay attention.
Well, as a reminder for anybody that watches it, the book is Deep Delta Justice. It's a great read. I know everybody says, oh, this should always be made into a movie, but this would be great because of the people involved, and that Gary really does have a great story. And I commend you for the work that you did to bring it to all of our attention. So Matthew Van Meter, thank you so much for being a part of the Southern Festival of Books.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. I really, really appreciate it.
And thanks to all of you for tuning in. We've got continued great books that we want you to hear about, and great other authors and interviews. So please stay with us. This is a little bit different world than we're used to, but the conversations can still be enthralling, and the books are still worth reading. So thank you for your time, and good night.